Welcome to the lecture Digital 3D Documentations in Archaeology. Digital Photography as Basic Tool. This lecture covers the basics of successful digital photography for different purposes, from impressive snapshots to illustrate one's own work, to expressive object and detail photos, and finally to seamless series for image-based 3D reconstruction. The goal should be to consider different aspects of photography in the context of archaeology and thus to create the appropriate basic material before, during, and after a documentation. This didactic approach is thus fundamentally different from most introductions to photography in the context of archaeology. The advantages and disadvantages or the different purposes of smartphone cameras and professional camera systems, which are necessary in selected recording situations, are also discussed in here. Here we see an overview of the topics we want to discuss in this lecture. This should help us later to find the individual topics more quickly. Photography in all its facets has been the foundation of scientific documentation in archaeology for generations and has recently become a fundamental tool for digital 3D reconstruction as well. Since the 1990s, it has been an integral part of archaeological documentation. Due to numerous advantages, digital photography has already replaced its analog predecessor. Meanwhile, the development of camera technology has advanced so much that almost anyone with a modern smartphone possesses an excellent documentation tool. We can conclude the purpose of a photo determines the effort in terms of technology, lighting, and composition. That's the reason why we have to deal with the technology and the specific purpose of use. Before we get started, let's familiarize ourselves a bit with the working equipment. Let's familiarize ourselves with the most important features of a camera that are relevant to our context without getting too lost in technical details. Nevertheless, it is important to have an overview of the most relevant camera properties for us, specifically in terms of aperture, focal length, and focus. While the ability to capture good photos has become easier due to technological advancements, photography remains a distinct science. Professional photographers leave nothing to chance, especially not relying solely on automatic camera settings. Photos are often captured in RAW format, allowing for manual adjustments using software later on. A multi-year education and a great deal of practical experience are necessary to excel in this field. The aperture, also known as the f-stop, refers to the size of the variable opening at the entrance of a camera lens that controls the amount of light entering the camera sensor. The aperture number is a representation of the ratio between the lens's focal length and the size of the aperture opening. It is often expressed as an f-number. A smaller f-number indicates a larger aperture opening, while a larger f-number indicates a smaller aperture opening. In general, we shorten the term aperture number to just aperture. The larger the aperture opening, the more light can enter the lens and land on the image sensor, resulting in a shallower range of sharpness. This means that the subject being focused on is sharp, while the background becomes blurred. This is particularly useful for portrait photography or emphasizing a specific subject. On the other hand, when the aperture opening is smaller, less light enters the lens, resulting in a greater range of sharpness. This means that both the subject being focused on and the background can be sharp. This is especially useful for landscape photography or creating panoramic images. With an action camera like the GoPro Hero 10, we can capture what are known as wide-angle shots with up to a 132-degree field of view. In the case of a digital single-lens reflex camera, the lens determines the range of focal lengths and thus the field of view. Focal length refers to the distance between the optical center of the lens and the focal point where light converges, and it is measured in millimeters. A shorter focal length creates a wider field of view and thus greater distortion, often referred to as image distortion. This is useful for landscape photography when you want to capture a wide view. On the other hand, a longer focal length creates a narrower field of view. This can be useful for portrait photography, as the background can appear blurred, making the main subject in the foreground stand out more clearly. However, it's important to note that a longer focal length can also result in a greater compression effect, where objects in the background appear to be closer to the main subject. There are specific designations for various focal length ranges: super wide angle, normal focal length, telephoto light, telephoto, and super telephoto. Standard lenses often have a focal length range of 18 to 55 millimeters, allowing for shots from normal to wide angle focal lengths. Additionally, there are macro and zoom lenses. Macro lenses are used primarily for close-up photography and, like zoom lenses, have variable focal lengths. We can summarize here: the shorter the focal length, the wider the field of view, and the stronger the distortion. Short focal lengths are suitable for landscape photography, while long focal lengths are suitable for close-up photography. The focus refers to the part of the image that the lens is directed towards, while the range of sharpness is the area of the image that appears sharp in the photo. When the lens is correctly focused, the area of sharpness will be sharpest around the focus point. However, the area of sharpness varies significantly with the focus distance, which is the distance between the camera and the subject. Indeed, we can establish the general rule that the closer the distance between the camera and the subject, the shallower the range of sharpness. For example, when taking a portrait, the subject's face should typically be the focal point, and the area of sharpness should encompass the area around the face. Depending on the desired range of sharpness, the aperture can be opened or closed to expand or narrow the range of sharpness. In the last examples, we saw that the range of sharpness, or the area around the camera's focus point where images have acceptable sharpness, is influenced by various factors. These factors include the aperture, focal length, and the distance between the camera and the subject. There are various formulas that can be used to estimate the range of sharpness based on these factors, but in practice, it's advisable to determine it through experimentation and adjusting camera settings. Alternatively, the range of sharpness around the focus point is also referred to as the depth of field. In the following section, we want to delve into image composition and explore ideas for creating successful and good photos. Image or subject composition is often a crucial factor, especially when it comes to the publication and presentation of work or landscape photographs. It's worth researching the key composition ideas, since image composition falls into the artistic realm and doesn't provide rules in the mathematical sense. The design aspects presented here are meant to provide suggestions and inspiration for your own ideas. A frequently used characteristic of art is deliberately breaking existing conventions and rules. There are many motifs that attract attention precisely because of their symmetry. Symmetrical motifs often lend themselves to a centered image composition. In some cases, symmetry can also enhance the depth effect. Architectures, streets, buildings, or portraits are typical for this form of composition. Above, we see the use of a vertical axis of symmetry in the image composition, and below, the use of a horizontal axis of symmetry. In the bottom image, we see a reflective water surface that has numerous symmetrical components. This is a typical candidate for a symmetrical image axis. The symmetrical cast iron pot in Bukhara, Uzbekistan, can also be well represented in a symmetrical image composition. With the golden ratio, there has been an attempt to mathematically express beauty in a picture composition. In the Renaissance, it was even called the divine division. Placing motifs centrally often looks inharmonious and boring. If we consider the center of the motif as the division ratio in the picture, the sides left A and right B would thus be 50% each. The golden section forms the division ratio in A with approximately 62%, and B with approximately 38%. A recursive division of the smaller area in each case provides the so-called golden spiral. The rule of thirds division helps us to create a similar composition very quickly. First, we mentally divide the display area into thirds from top to bottom and from left to right. We can now place the main object along the lines. As a recursive division of the image areas into two parts each by the golden section, the so-called golden spiral is created. This can also be used to create a harmonious image structure. The rule of thirds can also be applied to the horizon. If the horizon is at the bottom of the image, the distance and expanse are emphasized. The image appears open and airy because the sky takes up the most space. If the horizon is at the top, the closeness is emphasized. The picture has something closed. A central horizon can also have a very effective impact. Landscape photographs with reflective parts containing reflections offer a good opportunity to use a centrally placed horizon. Care should always be taken to shoot the horizon as horizontally as possible. A good example of a symmetrically chosen horizon we see on the right, which keeps the balance between light and dark parts of the picture. Especially in close-up photography, that is the specialized photographing of details, the use of focus to separate the subject from its surroundings using depth of field is a crucial feature. When the goal is to show an interesting detail in advance, but deliberately obscure the rest to create interest and not reveal too much. This tool is a good choice. Such shots are suitable in accompanying online channels and later for presentations. Above, we look into a tent designed to protect the work on the controller from direct sunlight. The focus is on the central part of the display. Below, we see a section of some excavation finds, focusing on a reconstructed pottery in Bukhara, Uzbekistan. The rest remains deliberately obscured. On the right, the focus is on the front part of the door ring, at about 1/3 as the image splits. A balance between the proportions of foreground and background can contribute to a good composition. In photography, we speak of positive and negative space. In the positive space, we depict the main subject of the shot, and in the negative space correspondingly, the context, the surroundings. If the placement of the foreground object is not balanced, and thus the background is too dominant, as can be seen in the upper left, or the area of the foreground object is too dominant, as can be seen on the lower left, we can significantly improve the composition by rearranging the image detail, as can be seen in the image on the right. Foreground objects that are too weak or too dominant can often look unattractive. In many situations, it is certainly necessary to first clarify what exactly corresponds to the foreground object. From the top left image, the focus of the foreground object changes from the golden vessel with base plate to the vessel itself. Often the background also strongly distracts from the foreground object by complex structures and colors. The influence of the background can be well controlled and softened here via depth of field. The balance between foreground and background can also be intentionally shifted somewhat to convey contextual information. The detailed scientific representation of found objects follows a completely different strategy, which we will come to later. Here, the motif receives so much attention that it should be displayed as full as possible. Elements that are in the foreground can be used in such a way that the actual picture is framed with them. This technique is one of the standard techniques in painting. Framing can also be shown only by hints and improve the composition of the picture. The scene appears more complete. When used consciously, this technique can sometimes produce interesting snapshots. On the left, we see a complete framing at the ruined castle of Huld Lake in Denmark. The colors illustrate the cold, uncomfortable season. In the center, above, we see the Moshe Degaron in Bukhara, Uzbekistan, framed by trees on the left and right. Below, the audience of a presentation form the frame. In the cleverly chosen detail, which can be seen on the right, the ears of corn form the appropriate framing. Now let us come to the aim as motivation of a photo. Archaeological recordings of finds and features are a constant companion in practical documentation. Many participants of an excavation or a documentation make recordings. In the end, these are often brought together. The material is looked at, and, if everything has gone well, there are photographs that are not only find documentation, but are also suitable for reports, presentations, and publications. However, if we become aware of the goal of taking a photo when we take it, then we are able to make the right demands on the camera, exposure, environment, and composition. Certainly, a research proposal must include one or more relevant and current research questions and be linked to the right location, topic, budget plan, and team. However, that should not be the topic in this section. It is also about subjective quality. The subjective quality of an article, besides the content, is strongly dependent on the wording, the presented form, and especially on the use of professional photos and illustrations. After all, they form the first impression and underline the expected scientific quality. Successful applicants know the value of this investment. Of course, the choice of image depends on the context or the question of the proposal. As an example, let's take a successful excavation campaign where an aerial survey has taken place and construct the completed excavation into the context of the new proposal. Establishing the context between completed documentaries and new ones visually when there is a local proximity is certainly a good idea. Here, the shot of the palace complex in Karabalgasun, Mongolia from a multicopter serves to clarify the context. Photos in work and documentation reports. Archaeological excavations involve many steps. For example, areas are marked out, sediment is removed, quadrants are divided and drawn, features are cut, profiles are photographed and drawn, finds are recovered and documented, and the excavation area is usually carefully closed or otherwise preserved at the end. Especially photos that show actors during the necessary work steps can be very interesting for work reports. In relation to the project sponsor, regular work photos can be essential, very important, and necessary. In this way, work steps can be sold authentically. Here we have to be careful to respect the personal rights of the photographed persons and to obtain permission. We hold, work photos should show the work steps with the people and the context of the documentation situation together. Pure photos of single finds, technical devices, or empty excavations should be avoided. On the one hand, finds and equipment can be photographed at any location and are therefore uninteresting and meaningless. On the other hand, an empty excavation situation represents more of a documentation phase, which may be transferred into an excavation sketch and therefore has other requirements. Only the linking of the motif with the documentation or excavation, and the person provides the value. Working photos also include team photos, which not only promote cohesion among those involved, but can also be very helpful in later reports. Here too, a concrete excavation context in the background, even if it is only blurred, is better than a joint team photo in the restaurant at the project's final dinner. Partial shots of excavations depicting work processes with people, as seen on the left, are much more interesting for this area. The faces of the people pictured are not visible. Team photos, as seen on the right, are an absolute must, but should deliberately show the context of the site in the background, as in this team photo at Lake Koichaka in Austria, 2019, in front of the documentation area. Below, we see the suggestion of how long a documentation day in the Mongolian steppe can become. Photos that are intended to document specific excavation phases or sections have a higher demand on quality, lighting, and effort. Particularly good photos, which are well illuminated in most places and can be processed more flexibly later, can be taken with diffuse lighting with almost overcast sky without direct sunlight. If scheduling permits, a schedule with positioning and framing of the documentary photos to be taken is prepared and processed when shooting conditions are good. Ideally, the north arrow, at least one scale, and a photo plate are present and clearly visible in each photo. The purpose of these photographs is to reproduce the finding situation as objectively and as faithfully as possible. In the case of the documentation photos, a distinction should be made between perpendicular photos, which should be as free of distortion as possible, as shown on the right, and the overview photos, shown on the bottom left. Perpendicular images should be taken with the longest possible focal lengths in order to minimize distortion. Vertical photographs of larger excavation areas can nowadays be taken very well and easily by multicopters. Scales and photo panels are aligned parallel to the edge of the image. For overview photographs, perspectives are often selected in such a way as to better clarify certain feature situations and contexts. Let's move on now to photos in presentations. In modern presentation technology, the 16:9 slide format has more or less established itself as the standard compared to the 4:3 format. This is certainly also due to the fact that displays such as monitors, televisions, or smartphones with a resolution of 1080p or 4K also dominate in the 16:9 format. We maintain that the wide format 16:9 is the standard format in modern presentation technology and is preferable to 4:3. There are already also wider screen formats such as 21:9, which is very practical for computer work and corresponds to the super wide screen format of a cinema film. So let's assume that we want to create a presentation in the 16:9 format. Let's leave aside a few basic hints such as outline, presentation thread, text layout, slide content, etc., and consider the photo capture as a part of the presentation. The resolution of the photos plays a minor role here, as most projectors have a limit of 1080p. Typically, we place information about the slide content, date and presentation purpose, location, and also the slide number in the upper and lower slide area. For these recurring elements, we could call them slide signature. The use of a so-called slide master is suitable. The slide body now covers the remaining inner space that we want to fill. In the full screen variant, we use the completely available slide body for one or more photos. There are several composition variants available to us. We will take a closer look at two of them on the left. In the case of a slide filling photo, it sometimes makes sense to include single color light or darker areas of the image background already for text passages or supplementary images. Here, pay attention to complementary colors and the contrast between text and background. Above, we see a blue gradient, but this medium color tint allows both white and black image elements such as arrows and text to be effectively overlaid. This photo was designed specifically for the explanation shown, the positioning of a multicopter in a team. The situation is different for very structured photos whose contents are distributed over the entire shot, as in the three examples below. The three-image composition offers an interesting variant here. At this point, it should be mentioned that it is advisable not to redesign an image arrangement each time, but to copy an existing slide and to scale and crop the new images in it appropriately. Repeating arrangements work much better than randomly placed photos. In the upper right corner, we see two slides with the same layout. In both of them, extremely wide image sections were shown, which come into their own particularly well in a widescreen format such as 16:9. Below that is another arrangement using an extreme widescreen format. It is important to place the photos neatly, to cut the images neatly, i.e. to use the same start and end points for adjacent images and the same spacing between the images, and to use recurring divisions, which can be done very easily in PowerPoint, for example.